Okay, sorry, Chris, to cut you off there. Welcome back, everybody. This is the final session of the day, where we are going to be debating and discussing how we're going to pay for the decarbonisation of construction. It's a pretty open session in the way that, I have a little bit of an agenda, but not really too much kind of questions, because it can kind of go any way that we want to. So the opening, this to kind of give you why I'm asking this question, and I'm going to troll the Institute of Civil Engineering here slightly, because at their sustainability event, which I was a panelist and a presenter for, people got a little bit upset that I didn't have all the answers. I didn't have the answers after my presentation of how we're going to pay for it. And it kind of got me thinking, because then I was asked the question during the panel. I had an eye infection at the time, so I was half crying out of one side, like this. And I've fumbled the question completely, and I've contemplated about it a lot since I kind of screwed it up. And I think it's an interesting talking point, which is like, how are we going to pay for this? So it's a broad question, and I'm kind of happy for opening gambits and thoughts, starting with you, Chris. Okay. Chris passes to Eamon. I love that.
I'm thinking that Eamon's way more qualified than me to talk about, to at least start the discussion. I'll come in with, jokes and anecdotes and what have you.
Perfect. After you, Eamon.
No pressure, thanks. Look, it's obviously being in the SEAI where we do a lot to kind of help people along the way, both on the domestic and the non-domestic side. The reality is that we can't grant fund our way out of it. It just isn't financially. If you even look at the SMEs that we were talking about earlier on, so you've got, say, 230,000 odd, businesses, and most of them are SMEs. If you took it cost them, I don't know, 100 grand to do all the things they need to do, and we gave all of them 30 grand. When you start looking at those kind of calculations, it's a huge task. And then the reality is then, on the other side, is the supply chain element. So in terms of timelines, if you even look at the installation of PV, for example, in Ireland, there's a very good grant for PV for domestic, and now for non-domestic as well. There's a huge amount of people applying, but in reality, it could possibly take you 2 to 3 months to get the offer, and then 2 to 3 months to get it installed. So then you extrapolate that out to 2030 or further on. So I think in terms of paying for it, I think if you go back to the wedge that I was looking, probably people on here haven't seen the wedge, but if you're looking at, I think in terms of the challenge there, is that we really need to start to think about, and again, this seminar, I know it's talking about the kind of BIM element of things, but the use of smart technology and digitalization in terms of low cost, big impact things that people can do on a personal level, I think that's a huge part of it. And if you take it along the way, like we were saying, there will be an element of grant funding, but eventually regulations are going to come in. So the fact of the matter is, from an SEAI point of view, once a regulation engages, we can't grant fund that element anymore. So for example, if PV panels are probably going to be a requirement on buildings over a particular size, say after 2025, looking at the new EPBD. So once that happens, they're no longer eligible for us to give them money towards them solar PVs. So I think in terms of who's going to pay for it, I think there's a large element where it's going to be a mix of, there will be an element of assistance until the regulations come in, but then when the regulations come in, I think there's a large amount of money washing around that people aren't aware of. Whether it be the optimization of your building system, for example. The optimization of your building system, again, it's this use of smart technology. You're reducing your energy, you're gaining, and it's looking at all those pockets of money that currently are sitting in there. Now, they're not being utilised. Again, it's back to this whole idea of carbon having a value. People are going to start, I believe, to be, once we can link money to the carbon, people are going to start getting incentivized to do things. So money is going to there's going to be elements there where people are going to gain an advantage. So it's the use of smart technology and the use of adding value to the carbon is going to encourage people, and money is going to, there's a lot of fat, I believe, in the construction industry at the minute and within buildings due to the operational use and the others, and that has to be sweated out of it, because the reality is, and I don't like to say this obviously being from SEI, but realistically handing people money isn't going to happen. There's going to be a regulatory requirement. So, and again, it's not like we drop them once grants stop. It's all about assistance then. It's showing them where them pockets are.
Just to complement that, what if I said there's already the money available in the construction industry to do it? We're so inefficient in how we deliver our projects. The budgets we're setting today will cover anything that we want to do in relation to sustainability, because we're not able to deliver our projects in an efficient way. So the money's already there. What we need to start looking at is how we deliver our projects more efficiently to release that capital for us to just reinvest in the sustainability concept within buildings.
Are you stating, Ross, that we're not building on time and to budget? Is this what you're saying?
We can't cost control our projects.
Outrageous comment.
Just to that point, and I'll hand on to it. Like, there was a KPMG report looking at a number of different countries, and in terms of their gross value added per hour of work, and I think in Belgium it was about 45. This is for the construction industry. It was about €45, and in Ireland, now these were earlier figures from 2015. It was €22. So that totally feeds into what you're saying there. And again, it's the smart technology thing. Like, so again, we're looking at the BIM element. That element, so the BIM element, and then the modern methods of construction, the prefabbing, the factory-based systems, and even from a social point of view, like in terms of gender balance and all this kind of stuff in terms of the construction industry, you bring in the BIM and the modern methods of construction, like gender balance, I don't care what anyone says, it's not as attractive being on a building site every day of the week hammering stuff in for different genders. So the fact is, if it's a case that people can go to a controlled environment such as a factory and end up doing things that they love that otherwise they felt excluded from. So the BIM and the modern methods of construction.
They're also not cold and wet by being in a factory, which is a massive, massive gain.
Move
Yeah.
from construction to manufacturing. We manufacture. It's the terminology we should be using now, not constructing anymore.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Yeah, we shouldn't be constructing anymore. We don't construct, we manufacture. The only thing about it is that we kind of assemble everything on site in small, minute elements. We need to move all that off site and try to build in, modularize our construction. The Danes do it very well when it comes to residential and hotels. It's all modularized, it's all precast. Yes, precast construction is concrete. We understand that it's not good for the environment, but green concrete might solve that solution so far. But that's what they do. And in Ireland, we build multi-story, multi-unit apartments the same way we build the extension to our house. We bring in the timber, we construct it. There's teams on site hammering nails. Madness, absolute madness.
So I will add a little bit to this, but first of all, for anyone that was in the previous discussion, and I was mentioning about Vietnam and the forecast of when it might be underwater, I do want to put a clarification point out there, actually a correction. It's not the whole of Vietnam, it's the southern part of Vietnam, including Saigon, to be fair, so it's still very serious.
Still the major population
center. It's still the major population center, but it's not the whole of Vietnam, so I want to put that clarifier. I've since found the link from the New York Times to the original piece of research that was done. Anyhow, and by the way, Bangladesh is in just as much trouble in terms of flood inundation.
And Copenhagen.
Cork. Okay, and Cork, we're just learning. Okay, so, but I think the points actually have been already well made. There's so much inefficiency in the way that we currently work, and that has to be a large part of the funding, because it's, it was somebody mentioned it earlier on in a conversation. It was Clive from Plannerly was saying, we go into a shop, we buy something, we pay for it. In the construction industry, you might get paid in 75 days or 90 days or whatever. You're getting paid for doing rework. You're getting paid for wastage. You're getting paid for unproductive work on site. Yeah, exactly.
It's like the cartoon of the boats, which the small boat is original order, and then the big boat is change order.
Right, yeah, exactly that.
Because
yeah.
you make more money through fuck-ups than you do from actually original delivery.
Yeah. So, and listen, I have not worked in the construction industry I'm not a civil engineer. I'm a geographer, and I take an outside-in view of these things. But it does seem to me that there are massive inefficiencies in the way that we currently build.
So are we saying
and think about building as well.
So are we generally saying that one way that will pay for this is obviously grant funding is potential, well, non-potential way because it's too complicated, maybe early doors, but more that from a productivity perspective, you should just be able to build better with what you have on first order, which is compared to other industries, and we'll jump over to Archie in a second. There was a report by McKinsey and The Economist quite a while ago now, I think like 2018, 2017, where it basically mapped productivity gains of all major industries since 1947. So if you look at agriculture, it's at 16x. So they produce 16x more output today than they did in 1947. Manufacturing is 8x. Construction is 1.1x. So we have improved by 10% as an industry since 1947 compared to manufacturing, which is 800% improvement. So, I mean, it's all that bricklaying. I'm not having a go at brickies. They're fantastic, by the way. But it is a very manual, slow, old-fashioned way to build a building. Archie?
Yeah, I was just going to say about productivity. We probably need to score some of the speakers here, but there is an online scoring for the best speaker, and I think Matthew is really going for that. He said
hopefully.
He says if he wins, he's buying the beer for everyone in this room here, and Cosmos, I think they're pretty good as a sponsor. So if you agree, you can upvote us.
Shameless.
But what we're seeing with some more sophisticated organizations that are starting to consider carbon is that they're actually starting to price carbon, not at what it costs them now, but what it's likely to cost them in 5 years' time. So they're adding a shadow price, and even just changing that price of carbon from 40 to 120 euros per tonne completely changes the whole dynamics of their decision making.
So just to clarify there, just for a second, are you talking about the taxonomy of carbon output as a business? Is this what you're getting at, or something else?
Well, not quite sure about that, but the way that you would usually see it is there's a cost-benefit equation for these organizations that they can tolerate a certain uplift in cost for equipment, for the equipment or for renewables or for technology or for certain decisions they make. But they want to see that has a return over a certain number of years. So that cost balance equation at 40, say if you have €40 price of carbon, that has very little influence on your decision making. Changing out some of your mechanical equipment might have a payback of 12 years. It's not very favorable. But when you change the carbon cost of that, it can start to bring that down to 7 or 8 years, which is a no-brainer. So that's kind of the calculus that's starting to come into this now. And when we talk about where the incentives and where the regulations are, I think in a way they're all incidental. They'll happen in the background. But I think having better control of information related to the viability or the feasibility of certain technologies, certain materials. I think, as Eamon said there, you can't control what you can measure, and that's what's important. And actually, just you'll find that the balance between something that's on the cost side or on the benefit side of the graph, the difference between that can change fundamentally when the price of finance changes, or when other parameters change, like the investment horizon. Is someone want to flip this in 5 years? They're not going to think about it. But if someone has to build and operate this building, particularly residential, say, if someone is billed to rent and they're going to hold that investment for 15 years and sell that as a going concern in 15 years. They're thinking out, they're looking at investment decisions that have 20 years. And that's when you start having to zoom out, as the geographers would. You need to zoom out from just a building and think about the whole campus, the whole city district, and say, okay, I've got one building here that uses a huge amount of hot water. It's a residential building. Right beside it is a commercial building that needs cooling even in winter. Why don't I trade off? I'll swap. I'll give you my heat if you give me that water coming back cold so I can use it for cooling. And those trade-offs and that kind of district impact is another thing we can learn from the Danes,
Sorry, yeah, there was just one thing, and it's just I'd mentioned it before, and it's an example of the wastage, and it's this whole Cat A thing again. So essentially, 10,000 metre squared office block, fully fitted out with fan coils, all the M&E services, LED lighting, just an open plan, fire alarm, everything's fitted out to the last, all the fan coils, everything. The M&E designer has designed that system because he's being ordered by the QS to design it as basically as possible, or he needs to hit a price point. So he puts in 15 massive fan coils to technically heat and cool that space. The ceiling grid goes in, he puts in all the standard lights across the whole thing. That then, and the fact is, if it was a shell and core, what would happen is if a tenant asked for the shell and core, they would get a bag of money of what that Cat A would have cost from the riser out and get handed it, and then would put in what they wanted. But what happens is he goes ahead and does that, and then the tenant comes in. When you strip back, and the other thing is they say it shortens the program. It doesn't shorten the program, because as soon as you need to order one fan coil different, and typically they're all too big, so 90% of those fan coils are gone, and you need 25 small fan coils because you loads of cellular offices. So the time for an order and a fan coil, once you need one different, the timeline's the same, and sure, there's glass and partitions and everything else that's going to be needed. So there's just skips and skits the wastage that goes out. And even from a logical perspective, you're talking about cost. From a tenant's point of view, the landlord has essentially, it's like the equivalent of walking into a restaurant and you're sitting down and they hand you your dinner. And you go, what's this? And they say, oh, it's chicken and chips. And you go, yeah, I'm vegetarian. I didn't want that. Well, will you eat the chips? Oh, yeah, I'll probably have the chips, all right, yeah, okay. So they bring it back, they leave the chips, then they bring you out your vegetarian option, then they go, that's going to be €25. And you're like, but if you would have walked in before they started cooking it, he could have handed you €23. You would have added €2 to get exactly what you wanted. That is a huge lump of money. So in terms of money, in terms of timelines, in terms of embodied carbon, that simple process that happens purely because an agent says, actually, I don't want to walk into a shell and core. And this is a perfect example. You can walk in now and stick a VR headset on their head and they can walk around and you can show them what their fit out would look like. Never mind the big blank open plan office that it's not going to look like anyway.
It's a big skip.
Sorry, I get a bit emotional when I talk about Cat A.
So one of the other kind of debate points which I was going to pick up upon is that the construction industry has gone through a major transition before, and if you look at the 80s and 90s, I was still at school then, I can arrogantly say, was the health and safety movement, right? So there was a point in which we realized that humans hurting themselves on site is not acceptable at some point. Now, it took us a long time to get there, unfortunately, and one of the pieces of research that came out of MIT recently is they worked out how much tonnage of carbon will cause one death in the future. And that tonnage is about 4,500 tons. So if anybody is working on the line project, because I've done the math, the amount of embodied carbon going into the line in Saudi Arabia will cause, in the future, 300,000 deaths. That's a direct correlation, right? So from a cost perspective, and I presented this at a conference to very unsatisfied faces, shall we say, because that, from a concept perspective, we installed health and safety because we wanted to protect our site. And we're still doing that globally. Deaths still happen and injuries still happen on site due to lax health and safety, usually. But someone had to pay for that. And who? So, and from my understanding, it was just passed on to the customer, right? So is there just a natural sort of like, well, if we did it like health and safety, we'll just charge the government more money to build buildings? Is that an easy out?
That's currently what's happening, isn't it? Like if you want to build a sustainable building, if it's LEED, gold or platinum, there's a cost associated with that. So what's happening is that cost is passed on to the client, but it's then being passed on to whoever runs the building, whether it's a lease or whatever, because now companies are looking for more sustainable buildings. But I would say, going back to your health and safety became legislated, and company owners were getting fined, hurting their pocket. Some of them were getting imprisoned because of that issue. So it was affecting the companies that kind of, during construction, the consultants, the contractors, etc. The same thing will happen for carbon. It will become legislated that you need to hit the targets. If you don't hit the targets, your building won't go ahead, like what's going to happen in January, right? Doing your LCA calculations, like happening in Denmark. If you don't hit your targets, that building doesn't go ahead. So the entire industry is going to move in that way, I would say. At least that's my opinion of it anyway.
Yeah, no, it's like, I think in terms of the health and safety analogy, like, I suppose to some degree there's still, like, you'll see when you walk sites, you'll still see fellas who, and don't get, like, it's like night and day compared to what it was 20 years ago, but you'll still see on a personal level fellas doing ridiculous things without glasses on because they don't like, because it sweats their eyes or something, like. So I think the regulation is a big reason why the health and safety thing came in. I think in terms of if you're trying to, if you were looking to bring people on, possibly the kind of impression of smoking maybe these days is kind of something that if you could get it to the point where people, as opposed to, like, the regulatory thing obviously works, but like the aim, I think it would be great if the kind of, you know, I know this is a long shot, but like where someone flagrantly doing things that obviously generates ridiculous amounts of CO2 has the impression of somebody who's smoking in the car with their kid. Like, I had a teacher that used to smoke in class when I was in school years ago. Or when you used to go to the cinema, the whole of the cinema was full. Like, it was just, you could barely see the screen. Like, so, like, there's a kind of an impression there. Like, I think changing regulations or changing minds, I suppose, is the kind of two things that can happen there. But really, in terms of, like, the industry knows that it needs to happen. Like, there's that creme tool out at the minute where all these large investment funds are essentially typing in their details and it's saying, well, that building's going to be a stranded asset in 2028. That one's going to be a stranded asset in 2029. So it's either, like, you're either changing minds, you're regulating it, or you're linking it, like we talked, to money. They're the kind of ways that you can, obviously the change of minds would be a great way to do it, but, you know, again, it's the distance of it compared to health and safety. Like, you say to somebody doesn't have that, like I say somebody doesn't have the hard hat on, do you want to go home to your kids today? Like, what happens if something falls on your head? You're not going to go home. Like, it's a real, you know, whereas, you know, if somebody's doing something stupid and you go up and say, man, what about the planet? He's just thinking, well, it's 10:30, I need to get this finished, will you go? You know, so it's that kind of question, but I think minds, money, or regulation are the kind of ways to it.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. I mean, it seems to me that there is no more money. There's no more, you know, you ask, how do we pay to do it? Well, where does the money come from? You know, so that there's a philosophical argument really there about, well, how does anything get paid for, especially when you want to make such a significant change. So the money is the money. There is an example, I'm trying to tie a few strands together here, Matthew, so go with me on this, right?
Go ahead.
So Balfour Beatty Vinci, joint venture in the UK working on the high-speed 2 rail infrastructure project, and they've started using technology to solve a problem, which is the speed at which they collect information about stockpiles, right? So we have some technology that enables you to do drone flight planning and drone collection of data and then analysis of it using geospatial technology. They've estimated they could save about 5 million quid over a few years because it's faster for them to collect. You know, they're collecting volumetric information in 20 minutes instead of 2 days, right? So there's an economic output which they could use to then pay for decarbonising something else. So let's say that some of the money's moving around, right? But then there's also a health and safety outcome because there's no longer, you know, a massive team of engineers going out with ranging poles, climbing up 10-metre stockpiles, putting themselves at risk. So their risk management score goes down and their number of incidents on site also comes down. So that's a good outcome. And then their carbon footprint comes down because there's fewer trucks going around with loads of people in them going out on site, and it's just a drone and you're done. So that's a mindset thing, you know, and Eamon's point's well made. It's either mindset or it's regulation or it's moving the money around, I think, is the way to do it. And the sooner that the owner-operators are creating the conditions, whether it's regulatory or whether it's just in their statement of requirements, you know, the employees' the exchange information requirement, whatever it might be, to say, no, you will work in this way if you want the work. So do you want the work or not? Okay, sharpen your pencils because you're going to have to think differently about how you estimate for this piece of work. But by using technology in that way, and, you know, I'm a technology geek, so I'm bound to say that that's part of the answer. But I genuinely think that it is, because we're still stuck in our old mindset of doing things the way we've always done them, and expecting a different outcome, which is the definition of madness.
Yeah. I mean, and you're 100% right, because I mean, like, if you look at what technology does, and obviously we're moving into an AI age now, we've only been in it a few months. What you're basically saying is money saved through productivity gain there, because you've saved time, which saves money, which means that you can then invest that money into something more useful, which goes back to what we were discussing earlier about the fact that, and I still think it's insane, that the fact that tier one contractors basically make 1% to 2% margin on building. Yeah. Now, the reason that they're happy with that, of course, is because they're guaranteed the money anyway, and if you do £10 billion worth of work, you know, 2%, you know, shouldn't be sniffed at. But that's why you don't get the money going.
But that's a crazy level. 1 or 2% is ridiculous. No one should get out of bed in the morning for that. But to come back to one of the points there, I think regulation is going to enforce the mind shift change. If we wait for the mind shift change, as you say, it's never going to happen. But I'll put it out to anybody here. Who takes their first meeting with new contacts face to face anymore? Does anybody do it? No, we don't. We use technology for it. But COVID has enforced that on us. We were put in a situation that COVID kind of forced us to now take on online meetings, you know? But we don't do it anymore. We use technology. So the possibilities are there. The technology is there. It's just we as humans haven't got our head around it yet.
I completely agree with you. The only thing that I'll add as a little sidebar is that, of course, the cost of the technology has a carbon cost. And especially in that example that I gave, it's storing, you know, terabytes, petabytes worth of information that's used throughout the construction project. So it's helpful all the way through. It's not just a point solution in one moment in time, but there's a carbon cost of the storage of that. So we need to make sure that that's added in.
Which is fine if it's counted, because I mean, like that technology already exists where you can have companies who basically measure. I mean, you can write down and store how much it costs to send an email. Like 0.002 kilograms of CO2, right? But then that's still a lot less than sending a carrier pigeon, you know, with a scroll on their foot because, you know, bird isn't shitting all over the place. And, you know, it's like one of those things where, like,
I mean, methane alone is
methane alone. I mean, as long as it's counted, it's okay. I mean, like, as long as it's not hidden, it's that transparent, so like, I'm doing a thing, that thing is costing me X carbon, then when I do that thing again, can I get that carbon down? Like that's basic. And that could be the fact that I'm sending 900 emails per project rather than 1,000 emails per project, or maybe use a CDE, which is just a more efficient way of sending digital communication across a design team and probably saves carbon. It could be a minuscule amount, but it doesn't really matter. The fact of the matter is it's saved and productivity goes up. Archie?
I think the danger here, though, is that when we talk about carbon and sustainability, we could fall into the trap that hampered BIM in its initial stage, that we get very good at talking among ourselves, but we can't explain it to grandma, you know. And like, I think that what's going to drive this more than anything, especially from a cost point of view, is risk. That investors are afraid that there is a carbon crunch coming down the tracks. They don't understand it, but they know it's a pain point. They know it's difficult. And there was an old cartoon as well that, you know, it was, what was it? What happens if we educate our staff and they leave and go somewhere else? And the guy turns around, well, what happens if we don't educate them and they stay? You know, it's a little bit like that for carbon as well. It's not, you know, what happens if we have to pay to make better buildings, do we get better returns? That's not the conversation. The conversation that's happening out there with the change makers and decision makers is more about what happens if you don't do this. And Eamon said they're already out there looking. They have really simple tools that will say that office, that shiny office block that you have there, that's going to hit the buffers in 2030. That's going to strand because you could have done something simple like reduce your fossil fuel and electrify, and you could piggyback a decarbonised grid. You could actually, you know, you could put that on a glide path to zero, but you didn't because you were looking out for the pennies and you weren't thinking about the big picture. You could have saved the pounds, you know? And I think that's why I think sometimes architects and engineers are quite myopic at looking at this stage. We got to get to planning. We got to get to tender. We got to get value engineering with the contractor, and they don't step back. And I think the Danes are very good at that. Like the decisions that they made, that they're making now, are based on plans that they made in the 70s, and they stick to them. And I think that's, you know, like that's Chris as a geographer is able to kind of pull back and zoom out and say, guys, as an industry, you know, this is what's important, you know, and I think we can't lose sight of that. That's what's important here. We can't be talking about, you know, equipment and materials and carbon. We just got to say, like, guys, there's a big, big risk if we don't get this right. This is only going one way. We gotta jump on this now, and we have to talk the language that it's simple, you know, it's simplicity. It's do this, or there's a carbon crunch coming, there's a pain point coming.
Just a couple of points, I suppose, just back to the whole money element. Like the whole area, there's a whole industry forming around.
They've just turned the air conditioning on. I mean, I'm not sure they wanted to shut up or, but keep going, Eamon. Keep going.
Flashing the lights version of a conference, obviously.
Project.
So if we in terms of how things, like, there's a whole industry forming around helping people finance. Like there's a whole industry there that understands the wastage that's going on the operation. Janie, coffee's ready.
It's done.
On the operational side of the carbon element, like you talk about what the problem is there. There's industries out there. So, for example, there's on the building management side, there's companies out there who have an AI version which basically goes in. It doesn't touch any of your existing BMS. It's an intelligent system that sits on top of your BMS, and once they've analysed your building, they drop that onto your BMS, and that operates your BMS, basically changing for all different parameters. They will guarantee you they'll guarantee you a saving per month, and you sign a contract with them, and if it doesn't make that saving, they make up the difference. And it's the same with energy performance contracting as well.
Just so a BMS is a building management system.
Oh, yeah. So
Just saving the acronym. No.
Sorry, apologies. And it's the same with energy performance contracting as well. You have companies coming in saying, "We'll put solar panels on your roof. You will save. You'll save this much overall. We're going to take 10% of that." Like there's all sorts of stuff going on. It's a whole separate industry.
I have one for you. There's a company in Denmark called Energy Machine. They will supply and install your systems for free, because they're generating the energy and electrical of those systems and feeding it back into the grid. So it's energy as a service. That's where we're going. Energy as a service. They'll maintain it for the next 30 years for you, no problem. And it's really good stuff. The problem that they're having is when they speak to people can't understand. Yeah. But what about the risk for me if I hand over my part of the building to you? Like, what do we do with that? And the FM facilities are looking at going, yeah, but that means you guys will come in and maintain it. Yeah, it's our system. You're renting it off us, and we're feeding back into the grids. It's really good stuff.
Yeah. Now, something similar happened in the UK. Now, this was more the grant where the feed, there was a really generous feed-in tariff that came in for feeding back into the grid. This is about 12 years ago. They had to cut it back because essentially what happened was it was financially viable for PV installers to fill roofs. They were going to warehouses and saying, we'll fill your roof with PV. You can have all the energy. So we'll fill your roof. You can have all the energy. And so there was a rate that you got for generating a kilowatt hour. You didn't even have to feed it. You got more if you fed it in. But if you generated it, you got a certain rate per kilowatt hour. So it was financially viable for them. They go to a warehouse and say, I'll fill your roof with PV. You can have all the energy and we're done. You just need to say that.
Which
we
is
can
mad.
Have the,
That's
we
a
can
mad
have,
business.
Yeah. But that's why about 6 months in, they realised investment funds were paying companies to buy 50, 60, 70 acres of land out in prime Yorkshire area because they were like, well, let's just start filling everything with PV. And, so then they reduced it to 50 kilowatts in the morning and all them companies disappeared. But, that's a kind of, wouldn't be advising on that. But that's another place, on the operational side, that's another place where the...
But but what we're touching on there is the grand old argument of CapEx versus OpEx, right? I mean, the capital expenditure, so, we've done a number of projects where you go and speak to the client and you will set up a meeting when you start talking about total cost of ownership, TCO, or life cycle assessment, or whatever acronym you want to give it. Okay, well, CapEx, should we speak to OpEx to kind of have an understanding of how we're going to fund this building over time? And 90% of the time, those people have never met each other, which is insane. I mean, it's totally mental because if I kind of have this, and I will accept a counterpoint after this. I kind of accept that if we actually spent twice as much building buildings, so we actually built high quality, energy efficient, high quality product buildings, made from, all the parts are made from good manufacturers, this stuff lasts a long time. It's basically grandma's washing machine that lasts 70 years. You will spend less money on the 50-year estimated lifespan, which is what government gives us, by the way. If you build a school, it should last 50 years. That's your calcs. We'll spend less. Do you agree?
Absolutely, and that's I suppose a kind of a mild estimate, I'd say, more than anything. And the thing about it is as well, it's the time of intervention. I think you were talking about lead earlier on. So there's a really basic calc and a really basic graph, and it probably shows the same. Matt MacDonald, who I would have done a lot of lead projects with, they have a basic graph that shows when you decide you want to do lead, depends on how much lead is going to cost. Not in terms of the overall, just in terms of the overall project, because it's the fact that when are the decisions being made. So if you bring in the lead consultant at the start, the changes that they advise for you to achieve lead gold are a fraction of what they are when the client has decided something, or you're in the middle of the design, so there is the material element, but again, it's that holistic thing, and the element that I think somebody talked about, tenants as well. It's the tenants that take over the buildings, which is a major issue that we have, and nobody can seem to crack it. Is the split incentive issue that we have with buildings, where basically the landlord owns it, the tenant is in it. They obviously don't own the building, but they're paying for the running of the building. So you have landlords who are saying, well, I don't really care if it runs efficiently because they're the ones paying the bill. And then you have potentially landlords who have an interest, and all their tenants are like, I've no interest. So this split incentive element, which is a huge problem in Ireland, and I think in a lot of countries.
We've solved that in Sweden, actually. So the way it works in Sweden is that, so most of us in Sweden, in cities, we live in apartment blocks. So take my building. So my building is 26 apartments. As a leaseholder, because I only own my bit, my square meterage. The walls belong to the building. I own a percentage of the building, which is according to the square meterage of the overall square meterage of the building. So the way that we do it is that I pay my mortgage, but every month I pay my avgift, which is the fees to run the building. But I own the building, so I have a board seat and a vote. And we have an AGM every year, and we discuss and debate how much money is in the account. We're profitable as a business, because the building is a business. And then we go, okay, well, how are the windows doing? Well, the windows had a 20, and actually they're up for renewal soon, because they're about 25 years old, 30 years old, and they're not efficient anymore. So it's like, okay, do we have enough money in the accounts to pay for new windows? And that is a discussion that's had by the tenants, because we own the building, we run the building,
So
right?
you
So
own the
and that
building
and
as
that's
opposed-
yeah.
Okay.
So it's shared ownership of I own my apartment, but then I also own a share of the building because I own the apartment. So there's no evil landlord, Dr. Evil kind of guy just sitting with his hands rubbing together going, it's great, they're just paying for everything, I don't care. It doesn't, that's not a thing.
But if
for
you're
us.
renting, so like it's a big element in the office market over here. So you might have tenants might have a 10-year lease so the landlord still kind of owns the whole thing.
Commercial's still like that.
Yeah, that commercial element is an issue. But yeah, that's a really good system, by the way. I must say.
It is starting to change though, with leases and contracts driven by some of the more evolved, some of the more mature blue chip companies. And there's a very interesting organisation, the Chancery Lane Project, and they have kind of drafted really simple clauses. But that's really interesting, and if that gets a foothold, I think it could start to impact on that. So that could be interesting. Sorry, Chris.
No, you're fine. You're fine. I mean, I'm just listening to the conversation here, and I keep just coming back to mindset. I love the reference to Grandma's washing machine, because the manufacturer had a longer-term view. Grandma didn't have a choice.
Well, also,
right? Grandma bought the washing machine that was available, and it was designed and thought through in a way that meant that it was engineered to last. Whereas
also there was a capitalist incentive for everybody to make stuff faster, and we were measured on how much we can sell, whereas now we have legislation coming in on things like right to repair. That stuff is now coming back in.
Exactly. So it's Back to the Future. Movie references, folks. But there is a bit of that, isn't there? That we have to step back and think, listen, the way that we're living isn't working. We know we're on a timeline, and we actually know, if you spend any time thinking about it, you do arrive at the conclusion that we sort of know what we need to do. So we're back to, well, how does it get paid for? It gets paid for through legislation, and people you want people to do the right thing, don't you? You want politicians to do the right thing. When did a politician ever do the right thing in recent times? That's a rhetorical question.
Well, the answer is no, obviously.
But it sounds as if to me in Denmark and in Sweden as well, there is a different mindset. There's already an acknowledgement that we have to think differently to solve these problems.
It's a little bit of socialism.
You keep
Is that what you're
bringing
going
that
to say?
word up.
No, but it is. It's socialist capitalism or capitalist socialism, whichever way you want to flip it, because it's finding that marriage between the two. Those countries are not anti-capitalism. They're not anti. You can't not make money. Of course, you can make money, but it's also like, how do you use that money for societal gain to ensure everybody benefits?
So I prefer to, instead of thinking of it as a capitalist socialist dilemma, I prefer to think of it as a sustainable question. Do we want to have a meaningful existence into the next 50 years? And are we prepared to make the decisions now that will ensure that unfolds and happens?
But unfortunately, people say no to that.
Exactly. But why?
Because they haven't. The realization isn't there.
And because it's confusing and there's not enough information. And well, we asked the question before: do you want to give up your car? Do you want to? Stop living
life is very simple. The way I'm living it right now.
Yeah.
You know, go out at the weekend, take my car to work every day, look after my family, do my my holidays in Thailand once a year. You know, go shop online. You know, 3 days a week, get it delivered. Very simple, not uncomplicated. Why are you complicating my life now? Why are you saying that I can't drive my car, I can't go to Thailand, I can't shop online three days a week, I can only maybe do it once, maybe I can't even shop online, I need to shop locally. Why are you complicating my life?
I know. And what is going to compel people to move away from that linear thinking, and what's going to help to change people's mindset to think, actually, if we continue down this path, well, you turn and ask the question, well, what kind of life do you want your kids to live?
Well, we'd like them to live one.
We'd like them
which
to live.
Could be one answer, but that answer kind of gets back. Oh, God. Like, that's the kind of. So look, we're coming up to like 10 minutes to go. Does anybody in the audience, or would anybody like to make a point or ask a question to the panel? Yeah, at least we have one to start with.
Okay, couple of notes that I was been taking from some things that you guys have been commenting. I do tend to agree that the money is already there in the industry, but I disagree that the fact that we'll become efficient in the way that we build will actually free up the money to be reinvested and to pay for decarbonization. Because what's going to happen, I think, is that even if you implement effective construction measures and you reduce waste, because the way the system is geared up, we'll just give more money for the people that are already given money. That money, unless there is something that forces you to put the money back into the system, it will never happen.
Exactly. Yeah. So legislation, that's where we're going. Legislation needs to come in place in order to be able to do that. And that's where I think that legislation like the LCA requirements and more sustainability requirements will force developers to now rethink. And the solution to that rethinking is, efficiency.
I think also that one possible solution is actually liability. You were talking about the idea of you are monitoring efficiency, and if you're not getting what you should get, then you get fined. But put it this way, if I'm a developer, I have zero benefits in building something that is effective if I don't own the asset on the long run. Because, as we were saying on the previous discussions on the panel, is like you always get into the point where I'm going to do this building and the cost is going to be compared with the previous building version of the building that I did, and because I'm taking a green approach or sustainable approach, is going to cost me extra. Until we reverse that equation, we'll never be able to actually square this out, because it's as simple as that. It's like if it costs more, why do you do it at the end of the day?
Well, so not so much to answer the if it costs more question, but the reason that I would expect developers and designers and urban planners and engineers to start to put forward more sustainable designs is because otherwise they will start to lose work. So if CEOs care about making a shit ton of money, staying out of jail, and outflanking the competition. That's all that keeps them awake at night. How do I make more money, or how do I outflank the competition, or how do I stay out of jail? So the legislation compliance thing takes care of the staying out of jail. So if you've got to do it in a certain way, then that's fine. But outflanking the competition or not losing market share is equally compelling a reason to do things differently, because otherwise somebody else will come along and do it for you. If you're not looking after your customer, someone else does it. It's the oldest saying in the book, someone else will start to offer that different service and start to win. And that maybe is another catalyst for change.
I would also say that we should kind of segregate the industry a little bit here and split it. The public sector, the public authority, are the biggest investor in every single country. They're the biggest asset owner. Let's start with them. The private sector will end up following because they'll have no choice. So it's the public authorities that need to step up and take lead and charge here in this process. It's the same with digitization, it's the same with BIM, it's the same with all of that. You know, because everybody in the industry is all affected by the public authority. We all work within public buildings, all of that stuff. So everybody will move together in one direction.
I totally agree. I actually had a note on that. It's like the legislators tend to act where they see the benefit of acting, right? It's like a legislator will tend to, because of the system that we have implemented, democracy that is, as Winston Churchill was saying, is the best of the worst systems that we have, of course. But the logic is self-preservation, right? So if I see that there is a trend and I can gain some benefit, I will act on it, correct? And so they will do the legislation that will do to benefit them. For that, we'll need a more informed general population that actually push for that. But I do believe that, as you were saying, walk the talk, right? If you want to make the change, like we did, for instance, the UK example with BIM, the decision that UK made to let's implement and enforce BIM informed a new industry, created the possibility for the UK to become a world leader in terms of framework, governance for BIM and all of these things. Because there was a vision that was led by, we need to save this money. If there is the same vision from a government to say, we are going to do this because it's right and because it's the only way that we will exist in the future, otherwise the planet is gone, you will create the market on its own because you have, as you were saying, the investment power to make that change. But I think also, and just to conclude this, I'm an architect, and it really shocked me when I realized that the way that my profession was perceived by the world was, you are the guys that are actually destroying nature to build concrete jungles. And that really changed the way that I perceived and brought me towards sustainability and more sustainable practice. And also the fact that as a father, I believe we have an obligation to leave a better world for our descendants than the one that we received from our ancestors. And that's, I think, is the key thing. It needs to change, and it starts with you, each one of us.
Well, that goes back, very, very well put, and I think it goes back a little bit to what I was saying earlier about, as construction professionals, we have an immense amount of power compared to the average human citizen, where we can have huge positive impact for the decisions that we make on carbon reduction. Because, you know, as you said, as an architect, you are making decisions, and this is one of the things that I love about construction. I don't think there's many other industries in the world where the impact of the work that you do today will outlast your lifetime. There are not many, because softwares come and go, products come and go, buildings kind of stay. You know, they do stay a long time, well beyond usually the original design brief. And therefore, like, we have this really cool kind of like, you know, it's like, you know, my dad was a building services engineer. And when we're in London, he still goes, I worked on that. Still, he's retired. I mean, he hasn't worked for years, but there's that sense of pride within and we forget about that. Like, we genuinely actually forget that actually construction is, considering the amount of problems that we have of productivity and it's still a pretty freaking cool industry, because you do have this longevity of influence. So I think that social pressure will come in. And the original point I was going to make was, I think also the consumer is changing. Now, it goes back to what you said, Ross, maybe not changing fast enough, that personal kind of way. But the consumer is changing in many, many markets around the world in kind of the things that we buy. You know, the consumer is moving to a more flexitarian consumption of food. More vegetarianism is, appearing. People purchasing organic goods is kind of like a requirement in food. But then also when you think about fashion, and so, like, you know, I had a 2-year-old recently, and we only, you know, we're only going to buy 100% organic cotton because we want to ensure she doesn't wear chemical-made clothes, right? So I made a conscious decision as a consumer to maybe change my behaviour. And there was an interesting listening to the Pubcast, which is a podcast by Joe Politics. I don't know if you heard of Joe Politics. It's like a young person's left-leaning. And they had a guy on there who talked about, well, there's 5 things that you can do. And one of them, we were talking about fashion. And he was like, at the moment, on average, the average American buys 50 new garments per annum. Right? Now, a T-shirt uses about 2,000 litres of water-ish in countries where there's not a lot of clean water. You can buy 3 a year. You're allowed to buy 3. And they actually worked out you're allowed to take a short-haul flight holiday once every 3 years and a long-haul flight. So they're not saying don't do stuff, but actually, like, that's your barrier of behaviour. And a lot of people were like, yeah, I could do that. It's all right. It's not too shabby. Way to think. You're allowed to buy unlimited amounts of recycled clothes, by the way, or like vintage clothes. Like, you can buy as much as you want. Second-hand guitars. So I think there is that. Guitars. So there is like a, I think there's a consumer change. Or that consumer pressure kind of comes across. We got to wrap up, but you can make a quick. Microphone there.
So really, just to add to your point, Matthew, that the other thing that we can all do as citizens is stop voting for people that don't understand the problem, right? And I know it's a desperately political statement, and I'm not that political, but what I observe is even local government elections, people continuing to behave in ways that are not going to help in the long term. And politicians are probably the short-termist mindset people that we know, right? So they are not going to help unless they understand the problem. So let's all just agree to stop voting for politicians that don't understand the problem.
Sorry, I'll make this relatively quick. Out of what I did work for a developer for about a decade, by the way, so I didn't agree with everything you said. I think the one aspect that I didn't hear you talk about is really, and I missed some of the start, is ESG and where funds are boycotting buildings that aren't going to be, not to mind seen as green, but are actually going to be green in 5, 10, 15 years. I've seen deals collapse in the last probably 12, 18 months as a direct result of ESG credentials not being in the right place, buildings not having the right philosophy behind them. So I'd ask the panel, have they, because the legislation is one aspect, but actually the money flow coming to the market, I see that as a bigger deterrent for developers, not so much the public sector, but definitely private, for having an asset that will be valuable in 15, 20, 25 years' time. Have you seen anything?
Yeah, so we were just speaking earlier just about the CREM tool, I suppose, that a lot of the property managers are using in Ireland at the minute. So the CREM tool will kind of relate exactly to that. So they're going in and this is popping out saying that thing that was beautiful 10 years ago was now going to be a stranded asset by 2028. So yeah, it is a really good point, and they're the ones. A lot of them, when they promote it, it kind of shows that it's kind of all of a sudden we've become really altruistic, but you always know there's money at the back of it. But yeah, no, look, it is a really important thing, and it feeds into that whole point again. The money appears when it has to, I suppose, is one way of putting it.
So I think that's a good point to wrap up. I can see questions here on my screen, but we haven't had time. Apologies to kind of get onto questions coming from the online. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, but I'll try and do that magically somehow. I'm not sure, 100% sure, but yes, I can try and do that. So yeah, thank you, gentlemen, and thank you everybody for attending today. It's been we could talk about hours for this. Remember to vote for the best speaker of the day, which is me,
Matthew.
And the best sponsor of the day, which is Cosmos. Is this what we've agreed to sell?
ESRI have agreed to.
Also, Esri. And if you're still listening, remember to join Zero because it's awesome, and listen to my podcast. That's also awesome as well. And maybe we should do a podcast session on ESG. You see. Yeah. So thank you very much, and now let's go and have some Guinness.
I was going to say, where's our Guinness? Yeah.
Guinness for all. Guinness for all. Thank you very much.
Thanks.